Hello, welcome to another weekly episode of Bingley Talks Politics. And this week we're going to talk about political leadership, and we thought it'd be interesting to compare some leaders that are not necessarily the most obvious choices, although in their own right they're all well known and pretty impactful. We might even go a little bit beyond that and talk about some examples from other sorts of leaders, because like it or not, the role of the leader is clearly important. It's what a lot of people want to talk about or think about when they looking at politics and the impact they can make. Max Weber, the relatively famous German sociologist, he wrote quite a lot about leadership, and he sort of picked out some key things which we might come back to. And he talked about charismatic leadership, which is all about the leader's charisma. Now, bear in mind, he's writing this approximately 120 years ago. We can apply that perhaps to our current times quite a lot, really. He talks about charismatic leadership, where they bring a certain personality, a certain style, a certain charisma to the job. He also talked about sort of traditional leadership, where they rely on authority and those modes of tradition, which I think, when you think about it, seem to be quite important now. But I think there's a lot of other things we can unpick and talk about. Okay, so Finn, we're going to give the floor to you for a few minutes first, but we will chip in. But you can introduce who you want to talk about in the context of leadership, and this one's a relatively modern example. Finn.
So I want to talk about Angela Merkel, as I mentioned in the last episode, my all-time political hero. So obviously Angela Merkel, she left office December last year, and really Merkel, she's an inspiration, obviously for me, but also for political leaders around Europe. Merkel was not an exciting leader. Whenever you heard her speak, she was completely and utterly boring. But she was a safe pair of hands, and she brought a stability to Germany. Now, I think one of the problems that we're having at the moment in our politics is that people are just sick of hearing about it. And what Merkel did was, because she was a safe pair of hands, she brought politics off of the front pages. And what Merkel managed to do was to build her support around her stability and her strong leadership. So it's a very modest style of leadership, quite restrained. She was never emotional. I think, especially for women leaders get a hard time, especially in terms of showing your emotion. When Theresa May was giving a resignation speech in 2019, she was branded as being hysterical because she was...
Seems to be different expectations
exactly.
for women,
yeah.
Pretty unfairly, really.
And for men, you don't have that. If they cry, it's they're showing their emotional
it's
side.
branded as a strength, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So Merkel was very good at not doing that, and she was an incredibly successful leader. She developed Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Just to be clear on this, Finn, just talk us. She was a long-serving leader, wasn't she, Merkel?
She served for 16 years. Yeah,
so which is a very long time.
Absolutely huge amount. Yeah.
Just on that, some people might say, "Ooh, okay," but I thought that when you serve for that length of time, you're spilling over into perhaps an autocratic dictatorship style of rule. Nobody else is getting a go. What's the response to that? Because Merkel wasn't a dictator, was she?
Yeah. I mean, the Merkel never had a majority in Parliament like the Conservatives do here. She was always building a coalition. But I think really the reason why people voted for her so much was because she had that brand. People trusted her. It's like, when you go and buy a brand of product from a supermarket, it is exactly like that. People voted for Merkel because she was tried and she was tested. And, it's go with what you know, really.
Well, to link back, though, to that idea of charisma being important, that personality, what's the response to that question? Did Merkel have charisma?
Absolutely not. I mean, I think I mentioned this in the last episode as well, but the last German election, people who were vying to be Merkel's successor, it was basically a contest to be how boring you could be, because it's perceived in Germany that the more boring you are, the more stable of a leader you are. They love their bureaucracy, they love their rules, and that was the kind of contest around it. Whereas in the UK, obviously with Boris Johnson, it's much more about he's a good laugh, and people don't really like Keir Starmer because he's boring. So maybe it's that it really, to link it back to the point about leadership, it really depends on the population. Germans love a strong leader. Obviously, we know that from history. But it's stability that comes first for them. And charisma isn't really to be seen as a good leader in Germany, you don't need that charisma.
Yeah,
whereas here, it's a different story.
And I don't know if there is, alluding to the strong leadership and maybe dangerous leadership of the past, I wonder if there's a suspicion of charismatic and overly charismatic strong leadership can actually represent something slightly more sinister, slightly more towards totalitarian dictatorship, and then Germans obviously have steered successfully away from that and have become a very successful European country since World War II. So Merkel does bring all sorts of interesting things to the table, so to speak, doesn't she, with her style of leadership. So she was able to serve for so long because she was able to manage coalitions effectively.
Yeah.
And that's something different to the UK, isn't it?
Yeah, she was part of the CDU party, which is basically the Conservative Party of Germany, and she brought them solidly into the centre, which just made negotiations easier for them. She had more liberal policies which could agree with a broader range of opposition parties.
I'll just play, it's not something that I certainly think, but some people might suggest, because there's been still relatively few female leaders. We talked about emotions and the different role they have and people's view on them. What about this sort of stereotypically outdated view, really, that women are unable to really be ruthless in politics or have that cutting edge that you might need? It's not the case for Merkel, is it, Finn?
No. I mean, the counter to that would be Margaret Thatcher. You know, she was the most ruthless leader in modern times. But Merkel was sort of ruthless in another way. She had a lot of... she was very, very similar to Blair in the sense of... Blair didn't come across as ruthless. Like, Thatcher was good at, swinging a handbag around. Blair didn't do that. He was more kind of... he did it quite sublimely.
Yeah, so a quiet ruthlessness.
Yeah, and that's the same with Merkel. Merkel is the new Thatcher in
because the way she emerged as leader of the party, wasn't it, was by outpacing, outmanoeuvring, and it wasn't actually sticking it in the back, was it? It was in a speech where she stuck it in the front to one of her rivals, basically outlining why he was completely unsuitable, and it really showed a sort of steely edge that I think helped her, and she then was able to grow a number of different qualities that helped sustain her leadership, I think. Yeah. What about on the international stage? I know Obama was not necessarily an easy sort of colleague, if you like, whatever the best word is, of Merkel internationally, but at the start of his reign, but certainly by the end of his presidency, he seemed to rely on Merkel an awful lot. And I think he said to Merkel when Trump was elected, it's basically on you now. You could be what is usually called something attributed to the President of the United States, the leader of the free world. That's on you, Merkel, as leader of Germany. So he certainly rated her highly.
Well, she was a common denominator throughout from 2005 to 2021, and that's such a huge political achievement. But she earned that reputation. In politics, things always change quickly, so you've got to earn your reputation very quickly. And she obviously did that very quickly, and she kept that for such a long time. So from 2016, 2017 to 2021, she was the leader of the free world. Obviously, she was, you could be critical of her immigration policy, but she led the world on that. She led the world in many other fields, like the financial crisis. She helped significantly with that. She was always a force in global politics, and we don't really have one now.
Yeah, and something that I think, if you're going to design an archetypal political leader or a job advert for a political leader of a nation, I assume sort of decision-making capacity would be quite an important skill, and certainly she could make decisions, but Merkel had that way of thinking. It was in her character, I think, to be slightly deliberative, not slow, but might appear that way, to think things through and then come to a decision. When I actually think about that, it sounds perfectly sensible, rational way of doing things, really. You know, these are big decisions, you want to get them right. To make a quick knee-jerk decision might be really counterproductive, almost disastrous. And that was one of the things she did, wasn't it, Finn? Time and again.
Yeah, so she always, especially one issue that's particularly relevant today is the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. That it's an oil and gas pipeline from Russia to Germany, and it would have been significant. It would have boosted Germany's energy security quite significantly. But Merkel was quite sceptical towards it. She thought relying on Russia for oil and gas was a bad thing. Obviously, we know now in retrospect that she was right, but her party was for the oil and gas pipeline because of economic reasons, and Merkel delayed that decision. She didn't deny her party. She didn't say no to it. It still went ahead, but she passed it on to the new administration, by which time war in Russia, and then they had to immediately cancel it. So in that regard, she took her time with it.
And she was very sceptical of Putin, wasn't she?
Yeah, she was very sceptical. There was a clip when her and Putin met up. Merkel is really scared.
This is
the
dog thing, isn't it?
And yeah. Putin sat right next to her. He brought out this massive dog right in front of her.
And you could see her. She doesn't give much away usually, but you could tell, couldn't you, that she was not comfortable. Whereas Vladimir seemed to have a slight smile, shall I say, on his face. I think that comes from partly her suspicion of Putin. She was born in Hamburg, wasn't she? She was born in West Germany. Obviously, she was born when Germany was divided. But she grew up in East Germany under a communist state. And Putin spent time, didn't he, a number of years in East Germany as a KGB operative. But Merkel is really pretty suspicious of socialist, communist rule as it was in East Germany. And therefore there is that, whereas Putin almost seems nostalgic for it and maybe wants to get some of that back.
Merkel was a libertarian at heart. For every German chancellor, they have what's called a Zapfenstreich. I think I'm pronouncing that right. And it's where you basically get out the army bands, and they've all got big burning sticks on the shoulders. It does look quite reminiscent of a Nazi rally. And one of the songs that she chose to play was Du hast den Farbfilm vergessen, which is one of these like really old East German punk rock songs. It's meant about rebelling, sort of like the undertones of it were about rebelling against the East German state. So her formative years in Germany were really, in East Germany, were really significant as to forming her ideology.
I think I'll just do a link to our next one there, because I was unsure exactly who to pick. I think we'll do a small segment on this person. But I think, correct me if I'm wrong, or if you know, but I think Merkel, when you sort of mentioned her sort of personal ideology, I think she was a fan of Reagan. I think she liked Ronald Reagan, didn't she? Or she certainly liked part of his approach. I think she liked the idea, obviously, Reagan in the 80s and his branding of the evil empire, the Soviet Union. He was clearly anti-communist, and he was, the shining light on the hill of America. And I think Merkel quite liked some of that. So Reagan is someone that I'm going to sort of put into the mix as a political leader. Now, why did I decide on him? I'm quite intrigued by Reagan because he's an actor. He was an actor. If people don't know Ronald Reagan, American president 1980 to 1988, big friends with Margaret Thatcher, championed certain policies that you might brand as the new right or supply-side economics, Reaganomics as it was often referred to, and certainly had an impact. I think it's clear that Reagan had an impact. Some people still talk about Reagan's huge positive impact, won the 1984 election comfortably. Some people are a bit like Thatcher, really divides opinion. But I think with Reagan, it's to contrast, I think he definitely did have charisma, and I think that was his strength. I don't think he was nowhere near as intelligent as Merkel. I think that's a fair comment. Merkel was a PhD graduate, bunch of scientists, wasn't she? Yeah. So clearly very, very able academically. Reagan wasn't. Apparently he would lose policy detail, liked to sleep in the afternoon. He was 70 old when he became president, liked to nap in the afternoon. I think quite liked getting dressed up as like in his sort of like a cowboy uniform, for want of a better expression. He liked all that side of it. But that easy charm, that way of approaching leadership just seemed to work for him. And he surrounded himself with able people. James Baker was his chief of staff for a number of years and a close. He's the sort of man who ran Washington, if you like, for much of Reagan's reign. And you needed people like that. But Reagan was able to be the president, and he's a really, really impactful president. Mr. Cook, would you? Knowledge of Ronald?
Yeah, I'm Reagan's actually one of the few presidents that I think. I mean, he lost policy details all the time.
He did, didn't he? Yeah,
but he did have like priorities that he pushed through quite aggressively. Besides anything else, so his economic agenda, tax cut and deregulation, all that.
Huge tax cuts.
Yeah, whether you agree,
massive tax cuts.
He borrowed pretty much what Liz trusted, but at that time it didn't seem to do against him in terms of popularity. But also his Space Wars program against the Soviet Union, basically trying to bankrupt them, and also his whole nuclear disarmament agenda, trying to basically nuclear disarm Russia, the US, Britain. Thatcher pushed back a lot against that. She didn't like that one bit, apparently. But I give him a lot of time for that aspect of his agenda, the denuclearisation stuff. And I think James Baker as well was such a essential.
Yeah, it's a really interesting figure, James Baker, and I don't want to sort of sidetrack to a different person. But I suppose the idea there is that a leader who might not have the grip of detail or really be as intelligent academically, because Baker was a successful lawyer who certainly did have the grip of detail. You get someone else to do it for you that you can rely on.
Build a team.
Yeah. And you play to your strengths. And I suppose that's the same thing for Merkel, isn't it? She couldn't. You said she had pretty much no charisma. You can't go out and get it and pretend, can you? It would just look ridiculous, perhaps. Yeah. Whereas Reagan was the line that he used a couple of good lines. The one in the 1984 debate that he had, and I don't remember this, but I've seen it. I kind of remember him winning the election, but he was against Walter Mondale, who many people might know. He was a big figure at the time, but many people might not remember now. And they were the Democrats were trying, because Reagan was Republican. The Democrats were trying to suggest that Reagan was too old to be president, too old, you're senile, and too old. And Reagan, the way he did it in the debate, which I think is really good, he just brought it up and said, no, I don't think we should make age an issue in this election. I would really not like to bring up the inexperience and lack of, I can't remember exactly what youth, of my opponent, and I don't want to hold that against him. And I just that's a stroke of genius, really, isn't it? Just confront the issue, turn it, get a bit of a laugh, and it's kind of killed that issue, hasn't it? And it's like, you've got me on that. I don't think it's why he's won the election. I think the economy and the other things that he used to do. There was that famous, have you seen the advert, It's Morning in America? It's quite a well-known one. He just seemed to come together for Reagan, and I think he trounced him in '84. I think it was a huge victory. Yeah, he brings that charisma, but he brings that impact. Okay, let me say this, and I think it's the right side of it. I think he still had largely, although some people might disagree, a deference for the American system and democracy that a more recent charismatic president might not have done. And we can talk more about that after the midterms next week. So, I think Reagan, that style of leadership is quite interesting. You can come from all sorts of different backgrounds. You can have different strengths, but it can work. But I suppose it depends on the team you've got around you. It depends on the timing as well. Maybe the right time to start change, and that that consensus in America, the New Deal consensus they referred to it, was coming to an end, and he sort of led the change. But I think he does and will be remembered as a big change-making president.
He was a New Deal Democrat in his youth, wasn't he?
He was. His hero was FDR.
Yeah.
His hero was FDR, who was one of the great presidents.
If not the great.
Yeah, if not the greatest. So yeah, he was definitely. But then I think it started in the 60s, and I think with Barry Goldwater, and then the reaction against, that sort of, again, the big government. He was against big government. He really didn't like big government. I think it was the education. The Secretary of Education in America basically said, look, your job is to abolish your department, to get rid of you and your job and your team. He just didn't want big government. He was very much a traditional right-wing Republican, fringes of libertarian view there. But again, that suited the time to a degree.
Exactly. It was coming off the back.
Took a lot of people with it.
Basically, and the oil crisis and stuff. It was.
And he had a bit of luck, like the Iranian hostages that were released in 80. It was mainly Carter's work, actually. Just happened. Carter couldn't get it done and take the credit for it. So there is a bit about timing and luck. He used also another... We talked about elections and the simplicity of them. And I remember in 1980, he used a phrase to help him get elected. You just got to ask yourself, as a normal American, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? That could be a line or similar type thing that could be used in an election here, or the same sort of thing, that simplicity of message. And he used that to help him become elected in 1980. So a Republican, slightly different to presidents that had certainly been before him then, maybe not since to a degree, but yeah, a big impactful leader, Ronald Reagan. Mr. Cook, you're going to spice things up a bit here, aren't you?
I'm going to take us centuries into the past, as it is.
Let's go.
Well, we're in Britain, though. So we've had a Christian centre-right centrist, we've had a Republican, and now we've got a Whig, or a new Tory, as they were sometimes called. Pitt the Younger's mine, who is actually... I was stuck between him and Lord Salisbury, who I was going to talk about, because they are my two favourite Prime Ministers, probably. I think they're so fascinating. William Hague's got a great book on Pitt the Younger.
He has, yeah.
It came out a few years ago. Pitt was Prime Minister twice. He was the first Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Northern Ireland, actually.
With the Act of Union.
Yeah.
So tell everyone what his dates.
1783 to 1801. So he's the second longest serving Prime Minister in history, by Walpole. He's the only one that beats him at 18 years. Then he came back in 1804, when the Treaty of Amiens, Napoleon completely flouted it, and the Third Coalition came together, and then he died in 1806. He was Prime Minister at 24 years old. He became Prime Minister at 24 years old.
It's strange because we say leaders are getting younger now.
Yeah,
but
not quite that young.
Yeah,
he became an MP at 21. His dad, Lord Chatham, was Prime Minister before him. He was one of Churchill's big heroes, but he didn't last very long. I think it was a couple of years he lasted in office, and then Pitt comes along. I'm going to read a short bit of a poem. So I think it sums it up so well. Just how people, because
this is a new element to the podcast. I think we're really branching out here. I like it.
Well, to set the context, you've got Europe's terrified because the monarchies are collapsing. Napoleon's on the scene. Everyone's quite suspicious.
So we've just had the French Revolution. Yeah, Napoleon's on the march. And the radical going to dominate Europe.
Yeah, and the radical movement in Britain that was pushing for more enfranchisement and stuff like Catholic emancipation and getting rid of a lot of the restrictions again for Catholic participation in Britain was set back massively because the radical movement became associated with the revolutionaries who were beheading people and all this stuff. So, I'll just go. So, to set the scene. Above the rest, majestically great, behold the infant Atlas of the state. The matchless miracle of modern days in whom Britannia to the world displays, a sight to make surrounding nations stare, a kingdom trusted to a schoolboy's care. And I think, because obviously the perception back then was, well, this is a 24-year-old. I mean, you'd get it now, wouldn't you? So I'm 24. I think people would gawp if they saw me walking into 10 Downing Street. I'd gawp if they saw me walking into 10 Downing Street.
I'd quite enjoy it, to be honest.
I've got one fan. I've got one voter. So he came to power, and he had a lot of it. I mean, Napoleon hadn't declared war yet, but I think he's such an important figure for him. He was very, very solitary. He was very, very uncharismatic. He was very, very, kind kind of had this air of superiority by him, because a lot of people theorise in retrospect, well, maybe he'd had some sort of autism or something, because he had very, very strange work practices, personal relationships he struggled to maintain with people. But he was one of the most revolutionary prime ministers we've had.
Why? Come on then.
Because three things dominated his premiership. You had fiscal policy, you had foreign policy, and then you had the Irish question that it was referred to as at the time. So fiscal policy, Britain had just come out of the American Wars of Independence, and it had basically revealed that the empire was already becoming overstretched and, fiscally speaking, couldn't support a huge land army that it could battle someone like the American states with. So his biggest issue was basically getting the debt. I've got the figure here where our debt stood at somewhere, I think. But he did it in a very ingenious way. So, I mean, it was £243 million when he came to office, and he created a sinking fund, basically. £1 million went into it every year, so it accrued interest. And then in 10 years, he managed to pay most of the debt off, and it was down to 170 million quid. He reduced tariffs, for instance, and that actually worked in the sense he was worried about smuggling. So he had a huge issue with smuggling, apparently, as he came to power in the 1700s. So he lowered tariffs, and revenue actually went up because people stopped smuggling in goods into Britain because they had to pay naff all on the imports. The biggest issue, though, was his foreign policy, basically. So he comes to power, Napoleon's there. He creates something called the First Coalition.
Yeah, I remember he leads the...
Yeah.
Well, he's sort of kind of de facto leader of the coalition, different countries working against Napoleon.
The whole Roman Empire is still around back then, so you've got the Dutch, the whole Roman Empire, Spain and Britain. That gets completely wiped out. Britain gets kicked off the continent for years. It's kind of a massive... his Foreign Secretary Castlereagh at the time, who is another fascinating figure and very, very unpopular in Ireland. He was the Foreign Secretary.
Very unpopular in Ireland.
But both of them were kicked out. Yeah, they had no forces in Europe at that point. But he persevered. He created a second coalition. That failed. He then gets ejected. Well, he then resigns.
So he comes across as quite a tough figure, William Pitt.
Well,
is that fair, or am I misreading this?
Yeah, we've got to remember that he's young. He's incredibly young, and especially given the time most prime ministers get to office in the 60s back then.
And do you think he's aware of this? And
he's
aware
of it.
You mentioned arrogance before, but perhaps
but
you need some of that, particularly if you're young, to brush off any kind of accusations of...
Yeah. Well, it flowed from his father.
You're not up to it.
Yeah. And he had a very... it was the whole idea of the balance of power in Europe, this whole concept that dominated British foreign policy going forward for the next few centuries, the idea that no country in Europe should have complete dominance. So the idea would be, for instance... In Pitt's view, you needed a strong Russia and a strong Prussia to balance the French out in Europe. And Britain, even though Britain had no obvious economic interests in, say, the Balkans, it was still important to keep the Balkans free, to maintain that balance of power, to not allow Russia to either go in there and take it over and then be able to cut off the Ottomans and stop the Austrians going in there potentially to dominate the area. But the Irish question, I think, is the biggest issue because it shows how principled he was. So, Castlereagh, for instance, if you look what Castlereagh's in his head, regardless of how accurate it ended up being, in his head he was terrified that the French were going to basically invade Ireland, apparently, and then use it as an outpost to hit Britain. So there were two expeditions in 1706 and 1906 and 98, where the French landed two expeditions in Ireland that were defeated, luckily. And Castlereagh and Pitt were the two people that worked on the Act of Union from 1801. But the issue is that Castlereagh only really signed up to the idea thinking, well, we've got 75% Catholic population in Ireland, so if this is going to work, they need to be able to enter the Westminster Parliament and represent constituencies in Ireland. And Pitt was completely behind him on this issue. He didn't see how it would be feasible allowing Ireland into some sort of union if you were not going to allow for the Catholics' political participation. And when basically Lord Fox and Lord North made clear they weren't going to go with this in Parliament, he resigned. He resigned his office. He said, I'm not going to be privy to this.
So, sorry to interrupt, I wonder, it's kind of a thing that the three perhaps share to a greater or lesser degree in different ways, is the principled stance on certain things. Political leadership is sometimes a balance, isn't it, between principles and sticking to them so people know what you're about, but also being pragmatic and adapting to events and being more flexible. Maybe all three of them, but Stat marks them out, is they had a bit of both.
Well, I think it's interesting what we're talking about. So, talking about leadership, there's a great fellow called Fred Greenstein who created this model about leadership, and one of the dimensions he talks about is public communication. And he talks about it's not so much whether you have it or you don't, it can be successful, and leadership itself comes in many forms. So Merkel, not very charismatic, but she does have some sort of communication, right? Like you said, she gets that message across: I'm stable, I'm the safe pair of hands, I'm going to look after you all. And she cemented this reputation, Reagan, without the,
it's like folksy, wasn't it? Like a folksy kind of communication and things like that.
And Pitt the Younger was just a ruthless press authoritarian, basically. And just, Pitt's terror, it's called, where he just basically clamped down on
Pitt's obviously, he wasn't governing a democracy, though, was it?
No, well, he actually is one of the few prime ministers that lost a vote of no confidence, yet just stayed in power. Ignored it. Why? Because the King George was back.
This is before even the Great Reform Act of 1832, which essentially gave the vote to a slightly bigger number of fairly rich white males.
Yeah.
So, we're quite a few years from approaching a democracy or something where we have, large elections in Britain. Yeah. But so it's a different nation there. But and he's still thought of. Many people have heard of him, haven't they? And they might not know exactly when or where he was, what he did to make his name, but he tends to be remembered.
Yeah, I think it's his age. I'm always astounded that. I can't even imagine. But bear in mind as well, back then, the Prime Minister had a lot more issues on their plate.
Yeah.
You had wars that were taking place halfway across the world, and you had to write with letters.
So he's clearly really capable, isn't he?
Really
capable. And you couldn't imagine someone of that age just getting to the top job now. No, and I don't necessarily would think it would be desirable, largely. Although, Mr. Cook, keep it in mind.
If anyone wants to
keep it in mind,
don't
rule it out. I sense we've got quite a lot more to talk about. I'm just conscious of time, and we can go. So clearly, they all share certain things. We've just picked a. 3 different leaders that interest us. There's quite a lot more we could talk about, and we'll come back to political leadership because it's clearly important. And in the modern age, perhaps we're slightly obsessed by who the leader is, and we give it perhaps a little bit too much thought and a bit too much focus, and it becomes too much of a big deal who the leader is when other things are important too. We can maybe balance it out with a discussion later on. So, if you're listening and you've got any ideas and or any people that you think have been or would make great political leaders, send them to us. We want to know. We want to know your thoughts. So we'll sign off for this week with that. And I think we've got, as I say, we'll probably pick a couple of these things up in future. But next week it will be America. What's going on there? What do the midterm election results tell us? And will it be President Trump from 2024? Will it be a Trump rerun? We don't know, but we might talk about that next week. Okay. Right. Cheers. Thank you. Bye bye.
See you later.
Cheers for joining us.